You recently completed a book.
I completed a book called The Greatest Bad Movies of All Time, in which I have 100 movies which are just so wrong that you stop and look at them and you say, did adults actually get together, spend large amounts of money, and create this? Most bad movies are just boring bad. They're monotonous, irritating, but some films are just so wrong. And I think that I wouldn't so much call them bad movies as I'd call them wrong movies. They're just so totally wrong at every level, at an intellectual level, at an artistic level, even a financial level too, considering some big budget extravaganzas that somehow got made and just came out so misshapen and bizarre that I think calling them, it goes beyond bad. But for lack of a better word, I decided to call it the greatest bad films, because they are great unto themselves. I don't think of them as classics. I think of them as anti-classics. And you have to admire just the sheer insanity of these productions, even if you can just spend endless hours making fun of their many shortcomings.
So what did you see as the origin, or when people started to appreciate this type of...
People started to appreciate that. By the late 60s, there was a film called Reefer Madness, which was made actually in 1936. It was originally called Tell Your Children, and it was an exploitation film financed by a small church, and the idea was basically to scare young people away from using marijuana. The people who made that film apparently didn't know what marijuana could do to you, and so as it was depicted, you take one puff of a marijuana and you turn into a complete maniac, giggling, eyes rolling, homicidal behavior, completely wrong, completely absurd. And the film actually had been in release for a number of years under a half dozen titles. Reefer Madness became the most famous title. Fell into the public domain, and it was mostly forgotten until a group called Normal, which was pushing for the legalization of marijuana, bought a copy of a print from the Library of Congress, and they used it as a fundraising film. And people who had never heard of this film came to see it, and they were laughing out loud. They couldn't believe what a crazy, silly movie this was. And a startup company called New Line Cinema picked up this film, and they started showing it at midnight. And this was, of course, the birth of the midnight movie circuit. And people would come and they would laugh out loud watching this zany film. And this was sort of the beginning of the so bad they're good films, that people were appreciating that this wrong old film and its insane notion of what drug usage can do to you. And some people got inspired and they say, well, if Reefer Madness is out there, maybe there are other old films we can dig up and have a great time laughing at.
You have, I'll call them best worst movies, but then you have Bad on Purpose, and Bad on Purpose is a whole other
Bad on
world.
Purpose is another, it's sort of an offshoot of that. It's let's make a film, instead of aspiring to make the best film possible, we aspire to make the worst film possible. And to me, it's not as much fun. I have more respect for people who go out and make a film which is so boneheaded, but they're so oblivious to their failings. But I'm still, at least, they were trying to do something, even though they went off track.
We're looking at Ed Wood and William Castle, right?
Right.
So William Castle kind of made intentional camp, right?
No, he didn't. No. William Castle made entertaining films that are viewed today as camp. But he was actually a very successful filmmaker, and he made a number of films. Actually, his most famous movie, he was supposed to direct the film, but Paramount Pictures said they would finance it if he didn't direct it. So they brought in Roman Polanski, and the film is Rosemary's Baby. If he had, so he wanted to make the film version of that. William Castle made films like Mr. Sardonicus and The Tingler. Today, you're looking at those as being not very scary per se. There's sort of a comic element, maybe it's a tongue-in-cheek element to it. But he never went out of his way to make intentionally bad films, and I don't think he was trying to be campy. He was just trying to entertain. It was a showmanship, because most horror of the era was not the horror we have today. It was a sense of shock, it was a sense of suspense, but it wasn't blood and gore, and there was always a bit of winking at the audience too. You could even see that in Psycho, if you really want to stop and analyze the film. It's really not an in-your-face horror type of movie. There's just a lot of wonderful quirks in that film, which Hitchcock was putting in, because Hitchcock did not want to make a slasher film. It would not have gotten into theaters, because you have to remember also at the time in the late 50s, early 60s, the production code was still in place. So there was just so much you could put on the screen. You couldn't get away with having a slasher running about cutting people's throats and faces and whatnot. So there would be elements of humor and some offbeat elements as well added to the films. But there was never intentional camp. Nobody knew Ed Wood existed until the late 70s. His films were all theatrically released, which is something that needs to be stressed. People would think of Ed Wood as being something of a failure, but he wasn't, because the films that he made as a director all went into theatrical presentation. Ed Wood's films were mostly unknown until 1979, when a book called The Golden Turkey Awards came out. It was written by the Medved brothers, Harry and Michael Medved. Most people know Michael Medved today as a conservative commentator, but he started as a film writer. And that was sort of, their book was a reverse Oscars, where they were giving awards for the worst film of all time, worst actor, worst actress, etc. And Ed Wood was named worst director of all time, and Plan 9 from Outer Space was named worst film of all time. And what's interesting is that they came to that conclusion actually through a vote, because the Medveds had an earlier book called The 50 Worst Films of All Time, and at the end of the book there was a clip-out coupon, and they asked readers to vote on what they feel is the worst film of all time, and that would be the next book. And to their surprise, Plan 9 from Outer Space was named worst film because it had a small but devoted cult following, and all the fans of Plan 9 got together and voted for that, because Plan 9 and Ed Wood were not in the 50 Worst Films of All Time book, which is rather interesting. So perhaps the Medveds weren't aware of Ed Wood when they got started writing about bad movies. But because of that book, people were very curious. They had never heard of Ed Wood. They never saw Plan 9. They never saw Bride of the Monster either, or the other Jailbait or the other Ed Wood films. And they weren't even aware that Bela Lugosi was in several of these films too. Most people only know Bela Lugosi from Dracula or some of the grade B films he made at Monogram Pictures. So this opened up a whole new wave of film scholarship to track down as much as people could find about Ed Wood and his association with Lugosi and where he fit into the whole Hollywood scheme. And since then there have been a number of books and documentaries, and of course Tim Burton's film, which was very entertaining, Ed Wood, though a lot of it is historically inaccurate. But up until the Medved brothers came along, people didn't know Ed Wood existed. In fact, Ed Wood had passed away before the Medveds came out, so he wasn't even aware that people were celebrating his work.